The wolf cub was standing in the middle of the trail, whimpering, not running, not hiding, just standing there, staring straight at Caleb with yellow eyes that looked almost human in their desperation. Its fur was matted with red clay, and one of its front paws hung limp, twisted at an angle that made Caleb's stomach turn. When he tried to ride past, the creature did something he'd never seen in 23 years on the range. It lunged forward and grabbed his stirrup leather with its teeth, pulling, not attacking, pulling, like a child tugging at a parent's sleeve. Behind the cub, maybe 200 yards up the canyon wall, Caleb could hear something else, the high, panicked scream of a horse in trouble. Not just any horse, a Mustang by the sound of it, wild and terrified. The cub released his stirrup, took 3 hobbling steps toward the canyon, then stopped and looked back at him, waiting. The ground beneath Caleb's mare shifted slightly, and a trickle of loose stones rattled down the trail. He looked up at the cliff face, at the cracked spiderwebbing through the sandstone, and felt his chest tighten. That whole section looked ready to come down. What I'm about to tell you today will leave you breathless. But first tell me, where are you listening from? I love knowing which corner of the country you're joining me from. Drop it in the comments below. Caleb Thornton had been riding alone for 3 days straight, pushing through the Nevada high desert with nothing but jerky, hardtack, and the company of his bay mare, Molly. He wasn't running from anything. At least that's what he told himself every morning when he saddled up. He was a ranch hand without a ranch, a cowboy without cattle, drifting between jobs like tumbleweed across the flats. The last outfit he'd worked for went belly up when the owner gambled away the deed in a poker game in Carson City. Caleb took his final pay and rode west, toward nothing in particular. The canyon country was unforgiving this time of year. Early autumn meant the days still scorched hot enough to blister leather, but the nights dropped so cold his breath came out in clouds. He'd been following an old cattle trail that wound through red rock formations, some tall as church steeples, others cracked and crumbling like ancient tombstones. The landscape felt empty, biblical. For 2 days he hadn't seen another soul. Not a shepherd, not a prospector, not even a drifter. Just hawks circling overhead and the occasional coyote print in the dust. That morning Caleb had noticed something odd. Tracks. Wolf tracks, small ones, crossing and recrossing the trail like the animal was confused or injured. He'd seen wolves before, big gray ghosts that moved like smoke through the sage. But these prints were different. Too small. A cub, maybe, separated from its pack. He didn't think much of it at the time. Nature had its own cruel way of sorting things out. A lone cub in this country wouldn't last long. But when the creature appeared in front of him on the trail, Caleb's hand went instinctively to the rifle on his saddle. Molly snorted and sidestepped, ears flattened. The cub didn't run. It just stood there in the center of the path, ribs showing through its dusty coat, one leg hanging useless. Its eyes locked onto Caleb's face with an intensity that made his skin prickle. In all his years working the open range, he'd never seen a wild animal look at a man that way. Not with fear. Not with aggression. With something else entirely. He nudged Molly forward, expecting the cub to bolt into the rocks. Instead, it limped toward him. Caleb pulled up short, his hand tightening on the reins. The cub reached his stirrup and did something that made his breath catch. It grabbed the leather strap in its teeth and pulled. Not biting, not attacking, pulling, like it wanted him to follow. Then it released him, hobbled a few steps toward the canyon wall and stopped. Turned back. Waited. That's when Caleb heard the horse. A high, piercing scream echoed off the canyon walls, raw with terror. It was the sound of an animal in mortal danger, the kind of cry that goes straight through a man's chest. Caleb had heard horses scream before, caught in wire, trapped in barn fires, tangled in quicksand. But this was different. This was panic, the kind that came right before the end. He squinted up toward the source of the sound, shielding his eyes from the glare. About 200 yards up the canyon wall, where the trail switched back toward the rim, he could make out movement. A horse, dark-colored, thrashing against something. A Mustang by the look of it, wild, unbroken. Somehow it had gotten itself wedged between 2 massive boulders on a narrow ledge. One of its hind legs was caught, twisted at a sickening angle. Every time the horse struggled, rocks and debris tumbled down the cliff face. The ledge beneath it looked fragile, eaten away by wind and time. Caleb's eyes tracked the cliff face, reading it the way a cattleman reads brands. Fractures ran through the sandstone like lightning, branching and spreading. The whole section was unstable. He'd seen collapses like this before. One good shake and half the wall could come down. The horse's screaming continued, desperate and raw. The cub whimpered again, looking up at him, then back toward the canyon wall. Its meaning was clear as spoken words. Help. Please. Help. For a moment, Caleb just sat there in his saddle, weighing the insanity of what the animal seemed to be asking. A wolf cub, probably no more than 4 months old, begging a human to save a horse. A wild Mustang that would just as soon kick his head in as look at him, on a cliff that was fixing to collapse at any second. The smart thing, the only sane thing, was to ride on. Let nature take its course. That horse was already dead. It just didn't know it yet. But Caleb had never been particularly good at walking away. It was the thing that got him into trouble more often than not. With bosses, with women, with men holding cards across a table. His older brother used to say Caleb had too much conscience and not enough sense. Maybe that was true. He looked down at the cub, at its pleading yellow eyes, at the way it held its injured paw off the ground. Then he looked back up at the trapped Mustang, still fighting against the rocks that held it. He swung down from his saddle, boots hitting the hard-packed dirt with a thud. The cub's tail gave a single, tentative wag. Caleb pulled his rope from the saddle, checked the knots, then grabbed his canteen and took a long drink. His hands were steady, but his heart was hammering. He wasn't afraid of heights. He'd roped cattle on mountain slopes steep enough to make a mountain goat nervous. But this was different. That cliff face was a death trap, and he knew it. The cub started up the trail toward the canyon wall, moving as fast as its 3 good legs would carry it. It kept looking back, making sure Caleb was following. Molly whinnied nervously, ears swiveling. Caleb tied her reins to a twisted juniper growing out of the rocks. "Stay put, girl," he muttered. "If I don't make it back, head for water. Someone'll find you." The mare stamped, nostrils flaring. She knew danger when she smelled it. Caleb started climbing. The trail was barely there. More of a goat path, really, carved by wind and runoff over centuries. Loose stones shifted under his boots, and he had to test each foothold before putting his weight on it. The cub struggled ahead of him, half climbing, half dragging itself over the rocks. Its determination was something to see. Most creatures would have given up, found a hollow to die in. Not this one. It kept going, kept climbing, driven by something Caleb couldn't name. As he climbed higher, the full scope of the situation became clear. The Mustang was a young stallion, maybe 3 years old, coat black as midnight with a white blaze down his face. Beautiful animal. He'd somehow gotten himself wedged into a V-shaped gap between 2 house-sized boulders, probably chasing something or running from something and not paying attention. His right hind leg was caught up to the hock, twisted backward. Blood streaked his flanks where he'd scraped himself raw trying to pull free. The ledge the horse stood on was maybe 4 feet wide, and it was crumbling. Caleb could see fresh cracks spreading through it like veins. Every time the stallion thrashed, more debris fell away, tumbling down the cliff face in small cascades. Below the ledge was nothing, just a straight drop of maybe 60 feet onto jagged rocks. The horse's eyes rolled white with terror. Foam flew from his mouth. When he saw Caleb approaching, he screamed again and tried to rear, but his trapped leg held him down. Caleb spoke low and steady, the way he'd talk to any spooked animal. "Easy now. Easy. I'm not here to hurt you." His voice seemed to absorb into the canyon walls, swallowed by the vastness. The stallion's ears flicked toward him, but his body stayed tense, coiled like a spring. The cub had reached the ledge and was sitting off to one side, panting, watching, waiting. Its faith in Caleb felt like a weight on his shoulders. He studied the situation, mind working fast. The horse's leg was wedged deep between the boulders, caught in a narrow crack. The more the stallion struggled, the tighter it got, like a Chinese finger trap. To free him, Caleb would have to get close enough to touch him, maybe even climb partially into that gap. And the horse, wild and terrified, would fight him every step of the way. One good kick from those front hooves would send Caleb right off the ledge. The ground trembled, just slightly, but enough to make Caleb's stomach drop. A rumble echoed through the canyon, deep and ominous. More rocks fell, pattering down like deadly rain. The cracks in the ledge spread wider. Caleb guessed he had maybe 10 minutes before the whole thing gave way. Maybe less. The stallion felt it too. His struggling intensified, became more frantic. The cub whimpered and pressed itself against the canyon wall. Caleb pulled his bandana from around his neck and moved slowly toward the horse's head. The stallion tried to bite him, teeth snapping shut an inch from his arm. "None of that now," Caleb said, voice firm but calm. He needed to cover the horse's eyes, block out the visual panic. Sometimes that was enough to settle them. He edged closer, boots scraping on stone. The stallion's breath came in great heaving gasps. Caleb could smell his fear, sharp and acrid, like metal. In one smooth motion, Caleb lunged forward and wrapped the bandana around the stallion's eyes. The horse exploded, head thrashing violently. Caleb held on, wrapping his arms around the animal's neck, letting his weight and voice do the work. "Easy, easy, easy," he chanted, like a prayer. "Easy now, let me help you. Easy." The stallion's muscles quivered beneath his hands. Slowly, incrementally, the thrashing lessened. The horse stood trembling, sides heaving, but still. Caleb didn't waste the moment. He moved quickly to the trapped leg, crouching down between the boulders. The space was tight, barely wide enough for his shoulders. He could feel the heat radiating from the rocks, smell the mineral sharpness of the stone. The horse's leg was twisted at a bad angle. Hoof pointed the wrong direction. It looked broken, or close to it. The crack that held it was maybe 3 inches wide at the top, narrowing to nothing at the bottom. The leg had slipped down into that narrowing space and gotten stuck fast. He tried pulling on the leg. The horse screamed behind his blindfold and kicked out with his front hooves, nearly catching Caleb in the chest. The ledge shook. More cracks appeared, spreading like frost across glass. Caleb's pulse hammered in his ears. Pulling wouldn't work. He'd just hurt the horse more and bring the whole cliff down. He needed to widen the gap somehow, shift one of those boulders. But with what? He had his rope, his knife, and his bare hands. Not exactly quarry tools. The cub appeared beside him, squeezing into the gap. It started digging at the base of one boulder with its 3 good paws, scratching away dirt and small stones. The action was instinctive, purposeful. Caleb watched for a moment, then understood. The boulders weren't embedded in bedrock. They were balanced, held in place by debris and smaller rocks. If he could clear away enough material from underneath, maybe one boulder would shift. Just an inch. Maybe that would be enough. He pulled his knife and started working, stabbing into the packed dirt, prying out stones, clawing at the debris with his hands. The cub dug beside him, both of them working frantically. Sweat poured down Caleb's face, stinging his eyes. His hands were bleeding, scraped raw on the rocks. Above them, the stallion stood motionless, blindfolded, breathing hard. Every few seconds, the ground would tremble, and Caleb's heart would stop. Not yet. Not yet. Just a little more time. His knife hit something solid, a flat rock wedged under the boulder like a shim. If he could get that out, the whole thing might shift. He dug around it, fingers scrabbling. The rock was bigger than he thought, maybe the size of a dinner plate jammed in tight. He braced his boots against the opposite boulder and pulled. Nothing. Pulled harder. The cub grabbed an edge of the rock with its teeth and pulled too, growling. Together they strained, muscles burning. The rock came free with a grinding sound. The boulder shifted. Just an inch, but it was enough. The crack widened. The stallion's leg slipped down another few inches, then suddenly, mercifully, came free. The horse staggered, nearly fell, caught himself. His freed leg dangled, probably broken, but he was loose. Caleb scrambled backward out of the gap, pulling the cub with him. The ground beneath them gave a sickening lurch. The ledge was going. Caleb could feel it in his bones, that terrible moment when stone becomes sand. He yanked the blindfold off the stallion's eyes and slapped him hard on the rump. "Go! Run!" The horse needed no encouragement. Even on 3 legs, he lunged forward, stumbling toward the trail that led down. Caleb grabbed the cub, tucked it under one arm like a sack of grain, and ran. Behind them, the canyon wall was collapsing. The sound was enormous, a roar that filled the world, shaking the ground, the air, everything. Caleb didn't look back. He just ran, boots pounding, legs pumping. The cub clung to him, claws digging through his shirt. Rocks flew past them, some as big as pumpkins. Dust filled the air, thick enough to choke on. Caleb's lungs burned, his legs screamed. But he kept running. He hit the main trail and dove behind a boulder just as the entire cliff face let go. The noise was apocalyptic. Thunder and earthquake rolled into one. A wall of dust and debris roared past his hiding spot, blotting out the sun. Caleb pressed himself flat against the rock, arms wrapped around the cub, and prayed. The ground bucked and heaved. For what felt like forever but was probably only seconds, the world was chaos. Then, slowly, it stopped. The rumbling faded. The dust began to settle. Caleb's ears were ringing so loud he couldn't hear anything else. He stayed still for a long moment, waiting to make sure it was really over. The cub stirred under his arm, whimpering. He let it go and it scrambled out, shaking dust from its fur. Caleb stood on shaky legs and looked back toward where the cliff had been. The entire section had collapsed. Tons of rock and earth poured down the canyon wall in a massive slide. Where the ledge had been, there was nothing now but a raw, scarred slope. If they'd been 30 seconds slower, they'd be buried under that rubble. Caleb's hands were shaking. His whole body was shaking. He bent over, hands on his knees, and tried to catch his breath. That's when he saw the stallion. The horse stood about 50 yards down the trail, three-legged, head hanging low. Still alive. The cub saw him too and gave a little yip of joy, tail wagging. It limped toward the horse, and the stallion, this wild creature who should have wanted nothing to do with a wolf, lowered his head and touched his nose to the cub's head. Just for a moment. Then he looked at Caleb, dark eyes steady and knowing, before limping away into the canyon. Caleb watched them both disappear into the rocks. The broken horse and the broken cub, two creatures who had no business being alive, walking away together. He stood there in the settling dust, bleeding and exhausted, and felt something shift inside his chest, something he couldn't quite name. It felt like the ground giving way. It felt like being saved. Caleb made it back to Molly, who was dancing nervously at the end of her tether, eyes rolling at the dust cloud still hanging in the air. He untied her with hands that wouldn't stop trembling and tried to mount up. His legs nearly gave out on the first attempt. The adrenaline was draining from his system, leaving him hollow and shaky. He finally hauled himself into the saddle and just sat there for a moment staring at nothing. His shirt was torn, his hands were bleeding, and he was pretty sure he'd cracked a rib when he dove behind that boulder. The smart thing would be to ride out, put distance between himself and this cursed canyon. But Caleb couldn't stop thinking about that stallion trying to walk on a broken leg, and that cub with its twisted paw. Out here, an injury like that was a death sentence. They'd be picked off by coyotes within a few days, or they'd starve because they couldn't hunt or run. The thought sat in his gut like a stone. He nudged Molly forward, following the direction the animals had gone. He found them a quarter-mile down the canyon, in a shallow alcove carved into the rock face. The stallion was lying down, which was never a good sign for a horse. His injured leg was swollen to twice its normal size, and he was breathing hard through his nostrils. The cub was curled up against the horse's belly, tucked under his chin like a foal. When Caleb approached on foot, the stallion's ears went back and he tried to stand. Failed. Tried again. The cub just watched Caleb with those yellow eyes. Calm now, trusting. Caleb held up his hands, showing he was unarmed. Easy now, I'm just here to look. He kept his voice low and steady, the same tone he'd used on the cliff. The stallion watched him but didn't try to rise again. Caleb circled around slowly, keeping his movements predictable. When he got close enough, he knelt down and examined the leg without touching it. The break was clean, above the hock. Bad, but not catastrophic. If he could splint it, if the horse would tolerate him getting that close, there was a chance. But splinting a wild Mustang was like trying to shoe a grizzly bear. Theoretically possible, practically insane. The horse would fight him, re-break the leg, probably kick Caleb's head clean off his shoulders in the process. And even if he managed it, the stallion would just thrash around and break through any splint Caleb could cobble together out here. It was hopeless. The humane thing would be to put a bullet in the horse's skull and ride on. But Caleb's hand didn't move toward his rifle. The cub stood up and limped over to Caleb, sat down directly on his boot. It looked up at him with an expression that was almost human, pleading, hopeful. Caleb rubbed his face with both hands, feeling the grit and dust in his beard. "You two are going to be the death of me," he muttered. The cub's tail thumped once against the ground. A decision was forming in Caleb's mind, one that made absolutely no sense but felt inevitable anyway. He couldn't save them here, but maybe, just maybe, he could get them somewhere that could. The nearest town was Copper Ridge, about 2 days' ride northeast. Caleb had passed through once 3 years back. It was a mining town, rough and lawless, but it had a veterinarian, old Dr. Brennan, who'd come west after the war and set up practice treating everything from mules to men. If Caleb could get the stallion there, Brennan might be able to set the leg proper. It was a long shot, more than a long shot, but it was something. First, he needed to get the horse on his feet. Caleb went back to Molly and dug through his saddlebags, pulling out the last of his whiskey, a half-full bottle he'd been saving for cold nights. He also grabbed his spare shirt and tore it into strips. Back at the alcove, he approached the stallion slowly. "This is gonna hurt," he said, unscrewing the bottle cap. "Me more than you, probably." The horse's nostrils flared at the smell of alcohol. Caleb poured whiskey over his torn hands, hissing at the sting. Then, moving carefully, he poured some on the stallion's wounds, the deep scrapes along his flanks, the raw places where hide had been torn away. The horse jerked but didn't kick. Caleb took that as permission to continue. He wrapped the cleanest strips of cloth around the worst wounds, working quickly. His hands were steady now, focused by purpose. The cub watched intently, head cocked, as if studying what Caleb was doing. Getting the stallion upright took 45 minutes of coaxing, pushing, and pure stubbornness. Every time the horse tried to stand, his broken leg would buckle and he'd crash back down. Caleb would wait, let him rest, then start over. He talked the whole time. Nonsense mostly. The kind of steady stream of words that was more about tone than content. "Come on now. You didn't survive that cliff just to lie down and quit. Up you come. That's it. Try again." Finally, on the 8th attempt, the stallion made it to his feet. He stood swaying, holding the broken leg completely off the ground, head hanging low, but he was standing. Caleb felt a surge of something like triumph. The cub yipped and danced around on 3 legs, celebrating. "Don't get excited yet," Caleb told them both. "The hard part's just starting." He needed to fashion some kind of travois, something to support the horse's weight while they traveled. He spent the next hour cutting saplings from the stunted trees growing in the canyon, using his rope to lash them into a rough frame. It wasn't pretty, looked like something a child might build, but it was sturdy. He attached it to Molly's saddle, creating a drag sled arrangement. The plan was to get the stallion to lean his weight on it, use it like a crutch while his good legs did the walking. Whether it would actually work was another question entirely. The stallion eyed the contraption suspiciously. When Caleb tried to position it under his chest, the horse sidled away, ears flat. It took another half hour of patient work to get him comfortable with the idea. Caleb had to physically guide the horse's body into position, then tie the frame loosely around his barrel with more rope. The whole setup was precarious, liable to fall apart at any moment. But when Caleb stepped back, the stallion took a cautious step forward. The travois held, took another step, still held. They started moving just as the sun began its descent toward the canyon rim. Progress was painfully slow, maybe 100 yards every 15 minutes. The stallion would walk a few steps, rest, walk a few more. Caleb led Molly by the reins, keeping the tension on the travois steady. The cub limped alongside, keeping pace. They made maybe half a mile before full dark fell, forcing them to stop. Caleb made camp in a hollow between 2 boulders, no fire, too risky with all the dry brush around. He shared his last bit of jerky with the cub, who gulped it down in 2 bites. The stallion wouldn't eat or drink, which worried Caleb more than he wanted to admit. Horses could go downhill fast when they stopped eating. He tried offering water from his hat. The stallion turned his head away. "Stubborn fool," Caleb muttered. The horse's ears flicked toward him. In the darkness, with just starlight to see by, the 3 of them made an odd picture. The broke cowboy, the broken horse, and the broken wolf, huddled together against the cold. Caleb didn't sleep much. Every sound made him jolt awake. The skitter of a lizard, the cry of a night bird, the wind moaning through the rocks. He kept thinking about that cliff collapse, about how close they'd all come, about the way the cub had grabbed his stirrup, asking for help, about the stallion's eyes when he'd touched noses with the wolf. Something was happening here. something beyond his understanding. These animals had formed a bond, and somehow Caleb had been pulled into it. In the deep part of night, when the stars were brightest and the cold bit deepest, Caleb heard the cub whimper. He looked over and saw it trying to climb up onto the stallion's back, seeking warmth. The horse didn't object, just shifted slightly to make room, and the cub settled into the hollow where the horse's neck met his shoulder. The stallion curved his head around and rested his nose against the cub's flank. They stayed like that, breathing in unison, two species with no business trusting each other. But they did. Caleb thought about his own life, the jobs he'd lost, the towns he'd left, the people he'd disappointed. He'd been alone for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to be needed, to have someone, or something, depend on him. His older brother had needed him once, back when their parents died and the ranch started failing. But Caleb had run off instead, chasing the promise of easy money in California. By the time he came back, the ranch was gone, and his brother had moved east. They hadn't spoken in 6 years. Dawn came cold and gray. Caleb woke to find the cub licking dew off the rocks, and the stallion actually standing, testing his weight on the travois. The horse's eyes looked clearer than they had the night before. When Caleb offered water again, the stallion drank. Not much, but enough. Small mercies. Caleb allowed himself a moment of hope. They got moving as soon as there was enough light to see by. The second day was harder than the first. The canyon opened up into badlands, rolling hills of exposed rock and scattered sage, no shade, no water. The sun climbed high and merciless. Caleb's water was running low. He gave most of what remained to the animals, taking only small sips for himself. His lips cracked. His tongue felt thick and swollen. Molly was flagging too, head drooping, steps dragging. The stallion kept moving, driven by some deep reserve of will that Caleb couldn't help but admire. Around midday, they crested a rise, and Caleb saw something that made his heart sink. Dust on the horizon. Moving fast. Riders. 3 of them, maybe 4, heading roughly in their direction. Out here, riders usually meant trouble. Claim jumpers, cattle rustlers, or just men looking for something to steal. Caleb glanced at his ragtag group. The injured horse, the cub, the exhausted mare. They couldn't run, couldn't hide. All he could do was stand his ground and hope the riders had better things to do than bother a lone cowboy. But the riders changed course, angling toward them. Caleb's hand moved to his rifle, then hesitated. 4 against 1 was bad odds, and he was already exhausted. He decided to wait, see what they wanted. As they got closer, he could make out details. Rough men on rougher horses, wearing the stained canvas clothes of prospectors or drifters. The one in front had a scar running from his ear to his jaw, and eyes like chips of flint. They pulled up about 20 yards away, horses stamping and blowing. Scarface looked at Caleb's setup and laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. "What in the hell are you doing?" he asked. His voice had a southern accent, thick and slow. The other men grinned, showing gaps where teeth should be. Caleb kept his hand away from his rifle, but his body was tense, ready. "Moving livestock," he said evenly. "You boys need something?" Scarface tilted his head, studying the stallion. "That's a fine-looking Mustang, injured but fine. What'll you take for him?" Caleb felt the cub press against his leg, trembling. The stallion stood very still, ears forward, watching the newcomers. "He's not for sale," Caleb said. The words came out flat, final. Scarface's grin faded. "Wasn't really asking," he said. The other riders spread out slightly, flanking Caleb. The threat was clear. Caleb's mind raced. He could fight, but he'd lose. He could run, but they'd catch him. Or he could talk, try to find an angle. "Horse is gonna die anyway," he said, gesturing to the broken leg. "Hauling him to Copper Ridge to put him down proper. Veterinarian there charges $3. You want him that bad, you can pay his bill." It was a gamble. Appeal to their greed. Make the horse seem like more trouble than he was worth. One of the other riders, a reedy man with a patchy beard, spoke up. "Copper Ridge is 2 days back the way you came, friend. You're heading the wrong direction." The words hit Caleb like cold water. He'd been so focused on moving forward, on keeping the animals alive, that he hadn't paid attention to landmarks. He'd gotten turned around somehow, probably after the cliff collapse. They weren't heading toward Copper Ridge. They were heading away from it. Scarface saw the realization on Caleb's face and laughed again. Lost, are you? Well now, that changes things. He dismounted, moving slowly, hand resting on the pistol at his hip. Caleb's options were narrowing fast. The cub growled, a tiny sound more kitten than wolf. But the stallion did something unexpected. He lurched forward, off the travois, standing on 3 legs between Caleb and Scarface. The horse's head was up, ears pinned back, teeth bared. Despite the broken leg, despite the exhaustion, he was ready to fight. Scarface stopped, hand tightening on his pistol. The other riders shifted nervously. A wild horse defending a man was wrong, unnatural. It made them uneasy. Caleb seized the moment. Like I said, not for sale. And I'd think real hard before you try to take him. That horse killed 2 men up in Wyoming, trampled them dead when they tried to break him. Only reason he's with me is he knows I won't hurt him. You pull that iron, he'll come for you. Broken leg or not. It was a complete lie, invented in the space of a heartbeat. But Caleb sold it with his eyes, his voice, his absolute stillness. Scarface studied the stallion, who stood trembling but defiant. Studied Caleb. The moment stretched out, taut as wire. Then Scarface spat in the dust. Keep your demon horse, he said. But you're a fool. That animal's dead already. You're just dragging around a corpse. He remounted and jerked his horse's head around. The other riders followed. Caleb didn't move until they were just dust on the horizon. Then his knees nearly buckled. He reached out and steadied himself against the stallion's shoulder. The horse turned his head and blew warm breath across Caleb's face. A gesture of trust, of thanks. The cub was still pressed against his leg, but had stopped trembling. Demon horse, Caleb repeated softly. And despite everything, the exhaustion, the fear, the impossible situation, he laughed. A short, cracked sound. They got that right at least. But the encounter had revealed a bigger problem. He was lost. Completely. Dangerously lost. He'd been so sure of his direction, but the Badlands all looked the same. Red rock and sage, endless and identical. He could wander for days and die of thirst before finding Copper Ridge, or anything else. Caleb closed his eyes and tried to think. The sun was past its zenith, starting its afternoon arc. That was west, which meant east was behind him. Copper Ridge was northeast. He needed to adjust their heading, but there was a more immediate problem: water. His canteen was nearly empty. Molly needed water soon, or she'd collapse. The stallion needed it too. Caleb scanned the landscape, looking for any sign: a line of cottonwoods, a depression that might hold a spring. Anything. Nothing. Just rock and brush under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The cub suddenly perked up, nose lifting, testing the air. Then it started limping purposefully in a new direction, away from where Caleb had been heading. Caleb watched the cub for a moment, then made a decision that felt both crazy and completely right. Okay, he said aloud. I'll follow you. He gathered Molly's reins and coaxed the stallion back onto the travois. They started walking in the direction the cub had chosen, moving slowly across the broken ground. The cub stayed about 30 feet ahead, nose to the ground, occasionally stopping to test the air. It moved with certainty, as if it knew exactly where it was going. After an hour, Caleb began to doubt. The landscape hadn't changed, and the cub showed no signs of slowing. His throat was so dry he could barely swallow. Molly stumbled twice. The stallion's breathing was labored. Caleb was about to call it off, turn around, when the cub suddenly yipped and broke into a 3-legged run. It disappeared over a small rise. Caleb followed, not daring to hope. On the other side of the rise was a miracle, a small seep spring, barely more than a wet spot in the rocks. But water was trickling from a crack in the stone and pooling in a natural basin. The cub was already drinking, lapping frantically. Caleb wanted to cry. Instead, he led Molly and the stallion to the water and let them drink first. They drank deep and long, draining half the pool. Only then did Caleb kneel down and cup water to his mouth. It tasted of minerals and stone, the best thing he'd ever tasted. He refilled his canteen and sat back against the rocks watching the 3 animals. The cub had curled up in a patch of shade, already asleep. The stallion stood with his eyes half closed, head drooping, but alive. Molly cropped at some dry grass growing near the spring. Against all logic, all odds, they were still moving. still surviving. Caleb thought about what would have happened if he'd ignored the cub on that trail, ridden past without stopping. The stallion would be dead. The cub would be dead. And he'd be riding alone through the Badlands, lost and directionless, with nothing but his own failures for company. Sometimes, he realized, you save something, and in the process it saves you back. He didn't have words for it beyond that, but he felt it, bone deep and true. He closed his eyes and let the afternoon heat wash over him, and for the first time in months, maybe years, Caleb Thornton felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. They rested at the spring until the worst heat of the day passed, then pushed on as the sun started its slow descent. The cub led them northeast, moving with that same inexplicable certainty. Caleb had stopped questioning it. The animal had found water when Caleb couldn't. Maybe it could find Copper Ridge too. Or maybe they'd all die out here together. Either way, he'd made his choice. There was no turning back now. As twilight painted the sky purple and gold, they crested a long ridge and Caleb saw something that made his breath catch. Lights. Distant. Flickering. Lamplight from windows. Maybe a dozen buildings clustered in a valley below. It was too small to be Copper Ridge, but it was something. A settlement. People. Help. The cub saw it too and yipped, tail wagging. The stallion raised his head, ears pricked forward. Even Molly seemed to sense they were close to the end. The descent took another hour, picking their way down the rocky slope in gathering darkness. By the time they reached the valley floor, full night had fallen. The settlement was even smaller than Caleb had thought. Maybe 8 buildings total, arranged around a central square. A trading post, a stable, a few houses. Lamplight glowed in windows. Smoke rose from chimneys. The smell of cooking meat made Caleb's stomach clench with hunger. As they entered the settlement, a door opened and a man stepped out. Tall, barrel-chested, with a beard that reached halfway down his chest. He held a lantern up, squinting at the strange procession. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, his voice rough as sandpaper. "What in the blazes are you hauling?" Other doors opened. People emerged, drawn by curiosity. A woman in an apron. 2 children. An old man leaning on a cane. Caleb's throat was so dry the words came out as a croak. "Need help. Horse has a broken leg. Cub's got a busted paw. Is there a doctor? Veterinarian? Anyone?" The bearded man came closer, holding the lantern high. He looked at the stallion, at the makeshift travois, at the wolf cub sitting at Caleb's feet. His eyes widened. "That's a wolf," he said flatly. "And that's a wild Mustang." Caleb nodded. "I know what they are." The bearded man, who introduced himself as Samuel, the trading post owner, called over his shoulder. "Martha, get Doc Brennan. Tell him we got an emergency." Caleb's heart surged. "Brennan? Dr. Brennan is here?" Samuel nodded. "Moved here 6 months back. Said Copper Ridge got too crowded for his liking. You know him?" Caleb almost laughed. He'd been heading to Copper Ridge to find Brennan, and Brennan had moved to this tiny settlement. Divine providence or dumb luck. He didn't care. An older man emerged from one of the houses, pulling suspenders over his shoulders, medical bag in hand. He was shorter than Caleb remembered, grayer, but his eyes were the same, sharp and assessing, missing nothing. Dr. Brennan approached the stallion, clicked his tongue. "How long's that leg been broken?" he asked. 2 days, Caleb said. Brennan circled the horse, examining without touching. "Should be dead. Why isn't he dead?" Caleb didn't have an answer that would make sense. Brennan crouched next to the cub, ran gentle hands over its injured paw. The cub whimpered but didn't pull away. "This is a wolf pup," Brennan said, looking up at Caleb. "You know that, right? Not a dog, a wolf." Caleb nodded. "I know." Brennan studied him for a long moment, then shook his head. "Get them both into the stable. I'll need light, hot water, and someone strong to help hold them down. This is gonna be a long night." The next hours blurred together in a haze of exhaustion and adrenaline. The stable became a makeshift surgery. Lanterns hung from every hook, flooding the space with warm light. Samuel and 2 other men helped Caleb lower the stallion onto a bed of straw. The horse was too tired to fight anymore. He lay on his side, sides heaving, eyes rolling. Brennan worked methodically, cleaning the wounds, examining the break. His hands moved with practiced confidence. "It's bad but not impossible," Brennan said finally. Clean break above the hock. If I can set it and splint it proper, and if he stays still long enough for it to start healing, he might make it. Might. He looked at Caleb. That's a big if. Wild horses don't take kindly to being immobilized. He'll fight the splint. Could re-break it, make it worse. You understand? Caleb understood, but he'd come too far to quit now. Setting the bone was brutal. Even exhausted, the stallion fought. It took 4 men to hold him down while Brennan manipulated the broken leg back into alignment. The horse screamed, a sound that made everyone in the stable flinch. The cub, watching from the corner, howled in response. Caleb held the stallion's head, pressed his forehead against the horse's neck, and murmured the same nonsense words he'd been saying for 2 days. Easy, easy, you're all right, easy now. When the bone finally slid into place with a grinding click, Brennan moved fast. He wrapped the leg in layers of cloth soaked in plaster, building up a rigid cast that ran from hoof to hip. It took nearly an hour. By the time he finished, the stallion had stopped fighting. He lay still, breathing hard, sweat darkening his coat. Caleb's arms ached from holding him. His voice was hoarse from talking. Brennan turned his attention to the cub next. The paw was dislocated, not broken, a small mercy. He gave the cub a dose of laudanum to calm it, waited for the drug to take effect, then popped the joint back into place with a quick, practiced motion. The cub yelped once, then went limp. Brennan wrapped the paw in a neat bandage and sat back on his heels. "That's all I can do," he said. "Rest is up to them and God." Caleb slept that night in the stable, sprawled on straw next to the stallion. He was too tired to even remove his boots. He simply collapsed and let unconsciousness take him. His last thought before darkness closed in was that he'd done it. Against all odds, all logic, all reason, he'd gotten them here. The rest was out of his hands now. He woke to morning light streaming through gaps in the stable walls and the smell of coffee. Martha, Samuel's wife, stood in the doorway holding a tin cup. "Thought you might need this," she said. Her voice was kind, maternal. Caleb sat up, every muscle in his body screaming in protest. He took the coffee and drank it black and scalding. It was the second best thing he'd ever tasted, right after that spring water. The stallion was awake, head up, watching Caleb. His eyes looked clearer than they had in days. The massive plaster cast on his leg looked absurd, grotesque, but it was holding. The cub was curled up against the horse's belly, bandaged paw tucked under its chin. When it saw Caleb move, its tail thumped twice against the straw. They'd made it through the night. All 3 of them. Dr. Brennan appeared an hour later, examined his patients, and grunted approval. "Horse should stay off that leg for at least 6 weeks. Longer would be better. He'll need to be kept still. No walking, no standing for long periods. Think you can manage that?" Caleb looked at the wild stallion, who'd never worn a halter or known a fence. "I'll manage," he said. He had no idea how, but he'd figure it out. Samuel offered Caleb work at the trading post in exchange for room and board. Could use a hand with inventory, loading wagons, that sort of thing. Pays not much, but you can stay in the room above the store. Stable's yours for the animals. It was more generosity than Caleb had expected or deserved. He accepted with a handshake that felt like a contract, a promise. He'd work hard. He'd earn his keep. He wouldn't run. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Caleb worked mornings at the trading post, hauling crates, organizing supplies, helping customers. Afternoons he spent in the stable with the stallion and cub. He changed the horse's bandages. He brought fresh water and grain. He talked, endless, rambling conversation about nothing and everything. The stallion learned to recognize his footsteps, would nicker softly when Caleb appeared. The cub healed faster, as young things do. Within a week it was walking on all 4 paws again, though with a slight limp. It followed Caleb everywhere, to the trading post, to meals, to the creek where Caleb washed his clothes. People in the settlement got used to seeing the wolf pup trailing behind the quiet cowboy. Children wanted to pet it. Caleb always said no. It wasn't a pet, it was wild, but it had chosen him for whatever reason, and he'd honor that choice. 3 weeks in, something changed. Caleb was in the stable brushing Molly when he heard a commotion outside. He stepped into the doorway and froze. The stallion was standing, not just standing, walking. Slowly, carefully, testing the leg with each step, but walking. The cast was still on, but the horse was moving under his own power. Dr. Brennan, who'd come to check on his patient, was grinning like a fool. "I'll be damned," Brennan said. "I've set 100 broken legs in my career. Maybe 10% ever heal enough for the animal to walk again. And those were domestic animals, animals that understood we were trying to help them. But this one," he shook his head, "this one wanted to live, wanted it bad enough to work miracles." Caleb watched the stallion take another careful step and felt something swell in his chest. Pride, joy, relief. By the 5th week, the cast came off. Brennan cut through the plaster carefully, layer by layer, until the leg emerged. Thinner than the others, muscle wasted from disuse, but straight. The break had healed. The stallion stood in the stable, shifting his weight from leg to leg, relearning balance. Caleb led him outside into the corral for the first time. The horse took 3 steps and stopped, overwhelmed. Then he took 3 more. The cub danced around them, yipping and playing, healthy and whole. It had grown in the weeks since the canyon, not much bigger but stronger, fuller. Its coat gleamed, its eyes were bright. It was still wild, still a wolf, but something had shifted. It trusted. It knew it was safe here, with Caleb, with the horse, with this strange little family they'd formed. Caleb spent the next week working with the stallion, coaxing him to walk farther each day. The horse's strength returned incrementally. He started trotting in the corral, then cantering, a 3-beat rhythm that was the most beautiful sound Caleb had ever heard. The leg held. The bone had healed straight and true. Against every odd, every prediction, the wild Mustang was whole again. One evening, as the sun set over the valley, Caleb was leaning on the corral fence watching the stallion run. Really run, full gallop, mane flying. Samuel came and stood beside him. They watched in silence for a long time. Finally, Samuel said, "You planning to keep him?" Caleb had been asking himself the same question. "Don't think I can," he admitted. "He's wild, belongs to the open country, not a corral." "What about the wolf?" Samuel asked. Caleb looked down at the cub, who was sitting at his feet as always. "Same answer," he said. "Soon as it's old enough, big enough, it'll hear the call. They always do." Samuel nodded. "And you? You gonna hear it too? The call to move on?" It was a fair question. Caleb had never stayed anywhere long, but something had changed in him out in that canyon. Something had broken open when he pulled that rock free and ran from the collapsing cliff. "Maybe I'm tired of running," Caleb said. Samuel clapped him on the shoulder. "Good. We could use a man like you around here, someone who doesn't quit when things get hard." They stood there as the light faded, watching the stallion run circles in the corral, and Caleb felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. The kind that settles deep in your bones and says you're home. A week later, Caleb made his decision. He opened the corral gate at dawn, when the settlement was still sleeping. The stallion stood in the opening, looking at him. Caleb held up his hands. "You're free," he said. "Go on, run." The horse didn't move at first. He just stood there, dark eyes locked on Caleb's face. Then he stepped forward and pressed his forehead against Caleb's chest. They stood like that for a long moment, man and beast, understanding passing between them without words. Then the stallion wheeled and ran, out through the gate, across the valley, toward the hills where the sun was just starting to rise. He ran like he was born to run, like he'd never been broken at all. The cub watched from the stable door, ears forward. It looked up at Caleb, then back at the running horse. Caleb knelt down and scratched behind the cub's ears. "Your turn's coming," he said quietly. "But not today, you're still too young." Martha found Caleb in the stable an hour later, staring at the empty corral. "You did the right thing," she said. "Keeping him would have killed him one way or another." Caleb nodded. He knew she was right, but it still hurt. Martha sat beside him on a bale of hay. "Samuel told me about your brother, about the ranch you lost." Caleb stiffened. He hadn't told Samuel much, but apparently he'd said enough. "You know where he is? Your brother?" Martha asked. Caleb shook his head. "Last I heard, he was in Missouri running a freight business." Martha was quiet for a moment. "Maybe you should write him. Tell him what happened out here. Tell him about the horse and the wolf. Tell him you're staying put for once." Caleb wanted to say it was too late. Too much time had passed, but maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was never too late. That night, Caleb sat at the small table in his room above the trading post with paper and pencil. He'd never been good with words, never been one for letters. But he thought about the stallion standing on that crumbling ledge, thought about the cub's pleading eyes, thought about the moment he'd decided to stop running and help. And he started writing. "Dear Thomas," he began, "it's been a long time. Too long. I've got a story to tell you, if you're willing to hear it." He wrote about the canyon, the cliff collapse, the 2-day journey through the Badlands. He wrote about Samuel and Martha, about Dr. Brennan, about the tiny settlement in the valley. He wrote about choosing to stay, choosing to stop drifting. He didn't apologize, it was too late for that, but he tried to explain. Tried to make his brother understand that he was different now. Changed. Ready to build something instead of running from it. 2 months later, a letter came back. Caleb recognized his brother's handwriting on the envelope. His hands shook as he opened it. Inside was a single page filled with Thomas's neat script. "Little brother," it read, "got your letter. Been carrying anger at you for 6 years. Your story about that horse and wolf made me think. Made me remember the kid you used to be, the one who'd spend all night with a sick calf. Maybe that kid's still in there. I'll be passing through Wyoming in the spring. Trading post in a valley settlement, I'll find it. We'll talk then." Caleb read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and put it in his shirt pocket, over his heart. Spring was 4 months away. 4 months to prove he could stay, could keep his word. 4 months to show Thomas and himself that he was worth a second chance. He looked out the window at the stable where the cub slept. The wolf was getting bigger now, starting to hunt mice in the corners, starting to hear that wild call. Soon it would leave too. But for now, they were both still here. On a bright afternoon in late autumn, Caleb was working in the corral when he heard a familiar sound. Hoofbeats, approaching fast. He looked up and saw a black horse cresting the ridge above the valley. His heart recognized the shape before his mind did. The stallion, the Mustang, had come back. He stood at the ridge for a long moment, silhouetted against the sky. Then he turned and disappeared back into the wild country. The cub, sleeping in the sun nearby, lifted its head and howled, a long, lonely sound that echoed off the valley walls. The stallion answered from somewhere in the distance, a conversation between 2 wild things who'd survived the impossible together. Caleb stood listening until the sounds faded. He understood what they were saying. We're alive. We're free. We remember. And that, Caleb thought, was everything. Sometimes the things we save end up saving us. Sometimes second chances arrive when we least expect them, when we're broken and lost and convinced we're beyond redemption. Caleb Thornton had learned that in a canyon in Nevada, with a wolf cub tugging at his stirrup and a Mustang screaming from a crumbling cliff. He'd learned that choosing to help, choosing to stay, choosing to try, that was what made you whole again. Has anything like this ever happened to you? A moment when you chose to help against all logic, and it changed everything? Tell me in the comments below. I love reading your stories. And if this story touched your heart, subscribe so I can keep sharing more stories like this. Sometimes we all need reminding that it's never too late to stop running, never too late to come home.